say, it's like full of parents. But I won't use the microphone. I'll just repeat what they say.
Okay, yeah, because the counters, people on Zoom won't hear that. Right. Okay, you got ready to start. Let me talk first.
Yeah.
Good morning. Glad to see you here. Let's get started. If you have a cell phone, if you can please remember to turn it off or turn it down to silent, I'd greatly appreciate it. Zoomers, if you could please stay muted. At the end of the presentation, if you have a question on the Zoomers, if you put it in the chat, I'll monitor the chat and we can ask the speaker. What else am I beginning to say? This is the new term now. So Dr. Bob Virnstein is our speaker for today, and here you go.
Yeah, on the screen is what I'd like to do today, to introduce the course. That's what's 5 talks and a couple films. And I also want to define what ecosystem services is, and to give examples of values. And that's a tough one, to convert ecosystem values to dollars. What's the value of a salt marsh or a wooded area? Those are hard things. But we'll put a dollar value on there, and I'm going to ask for your help in doing a specific valuation there. So and I'll cover some general methods, but we'll use only one of those. And because I spent my career working on seagrass in Indian River Lagoon, yes, I'll use examples from seagrass in Indian River Lagoon for assigning values. And I won't cover the whole course. If you're signed up for IRL, you have this. I just want to mention that the next speaker next Tuesday is Dr. Bob Christian, who will talk about blue carbon. Blue refers to the ocean, and it refers to plants like salt marsh, mangroves, seagrasses that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, put it into the roots and bury that carbon so it removes it from the atmosphere. And this is a bit pretentious for me. No, I'm not going to do the world's production of economic values from natural systems, but it has been done. They came out with a number of 33 trillion a year, but then there was kind of, oops, we missed a lot of things, and they redid the values 12 years later, came up with a value, and this is for natural systems of $125 trillion a year. That's in 2011 dollars. For comparison, the US gross domestic product of everything we produce is about $28 trillion. Whoop, and oops for me. So this is one example of how we might assign values to ecosystems, sort of willingness to pay. And some of them, the first ones are market prices. How much is a salmon worth? Well, you can say it's about $15 a pound, or a couple times that. A 2x4 costs $4, and people can do forest things of how many trees and diameter trees and estimate the board feet you could get from an acre of wood. So you can use market prices. And this is basically supply and demand that determines the price. But there are things that are go into the production of valuable things, like growing vegetables. and having good water to irrigate. Well, you don't buy the water, you buy the vegetables, but the water is a big contributor to the value. And then there's recreational kinds of things. And how much would you pay to travel to a nice area, like a good bird watching spot? And then there are things that are they get more vague as we go down this list. Damage cost avoided. If you had a wetland and it may store storm water and provide the downstream areas from flooding, well, how much is that worth? Well, you could estimate if you didn't have that, how much would you have to pay to repair from flood damage? So you could either pay some money to protect that wetland, or you could restore things after flooding. And the least costly alternative, if you're in that area, do you move? Do you sell? Do you elevate the house? Do you build a new wetland? Do you what do you do? And then there's some things not traded in markets, and you can do surveys of willingness to pay. And I'm going to ask you to help me with the project. Uh, Here. Oh, come on, help me. Oh, so how many have seen a polar bear? Not in the zoo, but in the wild. 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. Wow, I'm impressed. How many would pay money if costs were not an issue to see a polar bear in the wild? Most everybody. Now the hard question is, how much would you pay to assure that polar bears and habitats exist so grandchildren and great-grandchildren and next generations could see a polar bear in the wild? And suppose there was a program that had pretty good assurance that, yes, it would protect polar bears and have their continued existence. What would be a one-time cost that you would be willing to pay for that? And I'm going to think of a number, and I'm going to ask you the number, and we'll try to assign a value to polar bears by doing this. So how many would be willing to pay something? That's 2/3 of the group. I'm going to ask you for a dollar value, so have one in your head. Pushpa? No clue. How many has a Pam? $1,000. $10,000. Okay. 1,000. 10,000. Mary? 1,000. Okay. Yep. One-time payment was it? So that, I mean, that might, excuse me, that might average out to, let's say it's $2,000 per person, but not everybody was willing to do this. If it was half the group, then the $2,000 averaged is $1,000 a person. And everybody here is above average, so that I wouldn't use this group as the scientific basis for assigning values to polar bears. So maybe the general population is only a quarter of that. Instead of $1,000, it's a couple $100. Would most people pay a couple $100 to preserve polar bears? Well, if it's 100 million tax-paying adults in the US, that's still a lot of money. That might be what we might say is the value of polar bears in the wild. It's a pretty squishy number, but that's one way to do it for something like the value of a polar bear. And here's one example. This is a redfish, a red drum. This is a guy with a couple of friends came from I don't know, Orlando or Ohio, and he came for a couple days to fish in Indian River Lagoon, and he caught this big redfish. He didn't catch much else, but he's happy because he caught this one really big fish, which is a big fighter and a delicious fish also. So he may spend might have spent a couple $100 for travel, uh, some money for a few nights of motel, guides, and guides are expensive. That's a real number. A few $100 for meals. Got, of course, beer. And I was criticized in a previous presentation that that's maybe a way underestimate. So that added up to almost $3,000. So is that fish then worth $3,000? Did it contribute $3,000 to the local economy? This guy's happy, so he might come back next year in a couple of years to do this again because he caught that one fish. I want to talk about the value of seagrass. And just as a reminder, seagrasses are derived from land plants. They're higher flowering plants that have evolved back into the sea fairly recently, 30 million years, something like that. And there are only 60 or 70 species worldwide, depending on whether you're a lumper or a splitter. But they have various parts. And the things that they have that algae do not have, they have differentiation of parts, they have conductive systems. A lot of the parts, from about the tips of the arrows of here, below here is below ground. So that's non-photosynthetic tissue. So the seagrasses need a lot of light to support all that. And this is looking inside a grass bed. It's manatee grass. And the white dots you see are bubbles of oxygen that during a bright sunny day, it's taken up so much carbon dioxide, it's actually bicarbonate, and producing oxygen that it just gases off oxygen into the water. But you can imagine if you were a little fish, a baby fish, that'd be a great place to hide. And that's one of the great values of it. And the way seagrasses contribute to in the food chain, old leaves might break off. They're consumed by microbes and little critters that break it down, and then they're eaten by larger critters like the shrimp, and then by fish, and then we harvest those. The other way is that on seagrass blades, you get algae growing on the blades, things like amphipods and little crustaceans and snails. They graze on that algae. They're eaten by larger things like the shrimp, and then they're eaten by the fish, and we harvest the fish. So that's the way, a couple of ways the seagrass contribute to fisheries. And in terms of ecosystem services, except for the dollar value, I would list all those things as some of the ecosystem services that are provided by seagrass. I mean, tons of leaves that could feed manatees and marine turtles, lots of species, a very high diversity system, and a really dense system. I mean, this 1 acre might be 50 million small critters, big enough to see with the naked eye, and 40,000 fish. That's a lot. And it might be worth $30,000 per acre per year. How do you get a number like that? Well, this is one way. So it's not made up numbers, but some of the numbers come from FWC and Sea Grant, and it's older data, but it's mostly about the method that I want to present here and how you can get a number, and in this case, a big number. So it's the dollar value of money spent by fishermen Most of those are dependent on the Indian River Lagoon. Most of those are dependent on seagrass at some stage in their life cycle, even though the adults might be in other habitats. And then there's an economic multiplier that Sea Grant has come up with. I mean, if you hire a fishing guide, he spends money on boats and motors and gas and bait and tackle, so that money turns over in the system. And you come up with a value of almost $1 billion of economic impact just from fishing values alone. Convert that into today's dollars using Bureau of Labor statistics, and that's almost $2 billion a year in the Indian River Lagoon, the contribution to the economy by seagrass based on fishing. You divide it by the acres of seagrass, and you come up with a number of $30,000 per acre per year. That is a big, big number. It's more than you get from a cornfield or an agricultural crop, really. And another economic study looked at other values like recreation. Certainly having a home on the water adds real estate value. There's recreational parts. So they came up with this number of $3.7 billion, which in today's dollars is 5.4 billion. And it might be that 2 billion of that comes from the seagrass in the system. Anyway, those are big, big numbers. And the Indian River Lagoon is this coastal lagoon it actually goes from about New Smyrna Beach down to Jupiter. It's 155 miles. The red dots on it are seagrass transects, where and I'll say mostly that St. Johns River Water Management District, actually measure seagrass every 10 meters out from shore out to the deep edge of seagrass beds. So I've spent some time in the water, I think, at every one of those dots. And the green is the seagrass there. So over the course of time, back even in 1920s, there's Titusville, Cocoa, Melbourne, no, this would be Melbourne and Vero Beach down here. They existed, and you can see that the area has developed a lot. Not only has it developed, but some areas that were not part of the drainage system have been added because it was drained for ranch land. So with all that development, you might expect, well, there's some problems. One of those, this is chlorophyll A. It's a measure of the amount of phytoplankton, the microscopic plants in the water. It's the green stuff that you'd see in our pond here. And a high level of phytoplankton contributes to poor water clarity and problems with seagrass. Good values, and this is from 2003 to 2013. Good values are under 10. High values, a high value would be considered about 20. Here in 2010, 11, we see something unusual. Some of the values, and I say before 20 was bad, some of the individual values were 170. What does that look like? It looks like pea soup. This is an aerial view of around Cocoa Beach with the lagoon in the foreground, the Atlantic in the background. And in this water, at times, you put your hand in the water up to your wrist and your fingers started to disappear. So it meant that very little light was making it to the bottom for seagrass. And then what happened? We look primarily at the green bars. Those are That's the mapped area of seagrass in the lagoon. It's done every couple of years. It's in hectares, 100 meters by 100 meters. But the top one, about 32,000 hectares, is equal to 80,000 acres or 127 square miles. It's a lot of grass. And the black lines are the measure on the, excuse me, using the right hand scale and meters, the length, the extent from the shore to the deep edge of the grass beds in meters. So along this time when we get a lot of seagrass, the grass extended about 180 meters on average from shore. That's 560 feet, something like that, with the width of the grass beds. But obviously something dramatic happened. Well, we had 4 hurricanes in 2004, but don't see any impact from that. In fact, it may have helped by stirring up everything and washing out some of the mud and some of the organic matter. So we actually got some improvement after that. Uh, I, I, I retired and then things went to hell. It's correlation, not cause and effect. But what is the effect of that? It's about 20% of the area remaining. And the third line on here, the gray bars are the density, that is the percent of bottom that is obscured by seagrass. And that went from 20 or 30%, it's just this scale, 20 or 30% cover down to about 3% cover. Right, a shoot here and a shoot there generally. So combined, that means we lost about 97% of the seagrass biomass as food for animals. One of the impacts of that, and it made national news, is that we, in 2021, over 1,100 manatees died. A lot of those starved to death. I mean, typically manatees are these big, rotund animals. You could see their ribs. I mean, it was pretty pitiful. Fish and Wildlife Commission actually dumped lettuce in to sort of get the manatees through the winter, but still many died. So from Elizabeth, I consider it necessary to ask the so what question. What does this mean for science? What does it mean for society? The valuation of the fisheries from seagrass is about $1 billion a year. And you might say, well, and then most of that is because of nutrient pollution and mostly nitrogen. And most of that nitrogen, by looking at stable isotopes, is determined to come from human waste. In the Indian River Lagoon drainage basin, there are about 300,000 septic tanks. A problem? Certainly. It's expensive to clean it up. Estimates are billions of dollars, but suppose that was $5 billion. And the improvement in seagrass contributed $1 billion a year. You invest $5 billion and you get a 20% annual return on investment. That's a really good deal. So that's one of the reasons to have dollar value. Some people will say, well, expensive to do it. And we say, but yeah, seagrass is important. Well, if you're talking dollars and dollars, then it makes a little more sense to do the comparison. But even if we know, okay, it's nutrient pollution, it's nitrogen, we can do that by converting septic tanks to sewer treatment plants, it's advanced wastewater treatment. We know how to do it. But how do we get there? And my last slide is this quote that I really like. We know the science, and we would say with some confidence, if we do this, this will happen and we'll get these benefits. But, and sorry for reading it, but the main deficiency is in the organization and utilization of that knowledge and the political or social processes whereby that knowledge is applied. So we know what to do, but how do we get the action for that? And I'll take any questions.
We're going to put a mic. We're going to try something new. We're going to put a mic in the middle of the room here. So if you have a question, come. If you can't get up, then you want me to come to you, I'll come to you. But otherwise, help yourself up to this mic to ask questions. I got to monitor the chat.
Somebody must have a question. Somebody must have a question, or they're they online. Or I can hand you a microphone. Okay.
My husband, Richard Farwell, and I lived this experience. When he retired from the museum in Miami in 2004, he wanted to get out of Miami-Dade as quickly as possible. I was a school librarian. I made money, more money there than any place in the state of Florida. The decision on where to move was based on fishing. We moved to Point St. Lucie so he could fish in the Indian River Lagoon. He already had a boat in Miami. He got a little bit bigger one. He thought he deserved it, right? And so I took, oh gosh, like a $6,000 pay cut because I was still working. And so I worked in St. Lucie County, well, Martin County first, and then St. Lucie County, closer to home. Well, what happened? You specified. You put the years up there. And so in about 2014, we decided to move to Hammock. This is my home county. And we came up and looked at places, but we weren't going to retire for a while. I wasn't going to retire for a while. Fishing got so bad, I could look at your timeline and tell what happened. We moved earlier because of fishing in the Indian River Lagoon.
And you spent a lot to do that.
Yes, yes, because he sold his boat. He could handle the boat by himself and took a big part of the driveway, but that's okay. We found a house with a big old driveway. And so our son would come and fish with him from LA. 2 fishermen in my life. Okay, now my son fishes in the Pacific. And so we lived what you have just said. And we came to Hammock earlier because his major hobby, the primary reason to moving to that region of, we could move anywhere in Florida. But the further north I came, the more my salary went down. So I wasn't a happy camper on that point. But, you know, decisions families make. So we lived your story.
I'm guessing the value of fisheries to your husband could be calculated in dollars.
Oh,
He
yeah.
was willing to spend a lot of money to be able to go fishing and to catch fish.
He's a versatile guy. He switched hobbies. Okay? Now he's into other things here. and he doesn't go to fishing on the West Coast. He never liked the West Coast. They have too many thunderstorms over there, he says. I don't know about these things particularly, but he moved on to other hobbies.
Okay. But it's interesting that you made that decision despite some economic hardships or sacrifices.
Exactly.
Yeah. Other, the question on this screen, which makes more sense? Pour more billions on glades or the Indian River Lagoon? Um, you're asking a biased person. I, it seems to me they're spending on the order of $100 billion for Everglades. Can anybody help me out with that? It's a hmm? Close enough. Okay, Pam says that's a lot. I think because so many people live along the Indian River Lagoon, the economic impact is immediate, and all those people benefit. I mean, I've talked to the fishermen that were fishing on the river and take their kids out in the lagoon, and then they said, "No, we're afraid of the water quality," and the guy sold his boat, and he doesn't let the kids go in the water. So that has direct impact.
Real quick, Bob, I'm from the Caloosahatchee area. We have the same problem on the West Coast. So our seagrasses have gone down, our manatees are having the same problem that they're having on the East Coast. My question is, how do we go about justifying those numbers that you're giving us and convincing the political parties to invest in water quality in Florida? Because without water quality, we cannot be who we are and bring in the tourists and have drinking water. So how do we convince them? What do we do?
I think one of those ways of convincing him is don't say, well, I mean, they're discharging water from Lake Okeechobee, which impacts the Caloosahatchee River, both the salinity and dirty water and a lot of nutrients and a lot of algae. What's the impact in dollars? And one way would be to argue dollars for dollars. And generally, we don't have that information. I do know that in Sarasota Bay, it's the National Estuary Program that's led by Dave Tomasco. They spent about $300 million upgrading sewer treatment plants and stormwater treatment, and the seagrass has recovered a lot, and people were glad then to spend $300 million on that. Government did that. In Brevard County on the East Coast, they have, I think it's a penny tax that goes for Save Our Indian River Lagoon, and they're spending that on water treatment and sewer treatment upgrades. And people seem to be really in favor of that. Again, some of that times the economic argument is better than, well, I think seagrass is important. And any other questions? Mary, yeah.
Would pay $10,000 for a manatee. What's the situation with the manatees right now in the seagrass? I know they were working to bring it back. Are they doing better or?
They are doing better. One of the actual success stories, although the decline in seagrass, the Mosquito Lagoon, which is the part of the lagoon just north of the Space Center, the seagrass there has recovered quite well, and in the presence of a couple hundred manatees. So the manatees there are pretty happy, and actually the seagrass is pretty happy too. I think some of that was Mosquito Lagoon is different. Almost all the boundary area, the drainage basin is owned by NASA, so it's undeveloped. It's part of it is Merida National Wildlife Refuge, part of it is Canaveral National Seashore, and the grass beds there are in flats. At really low water, most of it is below knee depth. I mean, a lot of it, like even that big redfish, sometimes you'll see them in 6 or 8 inches of water. And so the seagrass tends to be on flat areas as opposed to the other lagoon where it slopes from shore. So when the conditions became good at that depth, all the seagrass took off. And it did it even in the face of grazing by manatees. So they're doing better. Thank you for your concern too.
My name is Diane Haynes, and whenever you have a question, if you'll introduce yourself just briefly, that would be great, because we love to hear what our neighbors have in the way of questions, etc. My question, and I'm going to go back to the polar bear. Looking at the lady back there who also spent $10,000 to see a polar bear in the wild. But I went up with a company named Natural Habitat. You may have heard of them. And they say on their trips that the trips are carbon neutral. So this is not really related to lagoons or whatever, but we were on Hudson Bay watching these polar bears getting ready to go out on the ice floes, which are disappearing. But how does the company, what do they, or how do they figure out that they are carbon neutral? Do they go through an exercise like you did here to put a dollar value on it?
I would say that's highly variable. Sometimes companies will pay, and there are companies that will, let's say, create valuable habitats, and you get mitigation credits for that. The company that has the trips for polar bears might not do that, but they might pay a company to create habitats, even planting trees that take carbon dioxide out of the air, and they purchase enough credits to balance whatever carbon they use for transportation that way. Um, I'm not sure of other ways, but they may convert the uh, electric vehicles and things that are just much more efficient. Anybody else? I'm here for a few minutes if you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.